Well, I was 8 weeks into my flower cycle. I've been patient as heck for 16 weeks. I've checked my trichomes, I've checked the pistils, my buds are nice and firm. It's ready to harvest, but I haven't got a clue how to do that. Wet trim, dry trim, curing? So I've been cruising through my social media feeds and Facebook forums and all these grow groups looking for tips on how to harvest my plants. And I'm finding that there's some very, very stubborn, opinionated people out there. And it just got really confusing to me, talking about wet trim and dry trim and then the whole curing process. And so you and I went back and forth a little bit.
Yes.
Shine some light on the difference between these two methods, wet and dry trimming.
Yeah, well, it really has to do with that harvest moment, whether you would rather, let's say, trim them up when they're fresh and wet and trim off the leaves and put them on racks to dry, or whether you just want to strip the leaves off, not trimming them down, but just pulling them off and cutting it, hanging it up and letting it dry for a certain period of time and then taking the buds off that way. My preference was to do the dry trim. Okay. I know if you've got a larger facility, you probably need to get this stuff moving through, so you might not have the room to let this stuff hang. Yeah. For me, I found that it was a much, much better way. It kept, I think, just the whole look of the bud better, allowed it to cure out nicer. When you trim a wet bud, and like I say, I could talk about this for any of us, if you were to take a leaf and bend it in half, it's going to leave a dark line. Well, this is what I found with a wet trim, is it bruises the leaves and it actually changes the presentation. It might not necessarily change the quality, but often it's the presentation, isn't it? We want it to look nice.
Well, certainly the stuff you buy at the dispensaries, is perfectly nicely trimmed. There's no leaves hanging off of it. It looks like a production line thing.
Of course.
So you're actually removing the bud itself and then putting it on some sort of a drying rack to dry?
Yeah, they'll have like screen racks that they'll put on. And like I say, they'll trim it close, but it is wet and let it dry out that way. That isn't something that, say, if you're an indoor grower, you're not going to have that much. And especially if you've spent the time that you have, 3, 4, 5 months to get to this point, why not spend just a little bit extra time to ensure that you're going to get the best out of your crop?
Well, speaking of time, how long, once you've chopped your plants down, do you let them hang or dry in a rack?
Well, I would say if you're letting them hang, with both, I would say probably 3 to 5 days, and you'll be able to go in, let's say if they're hanging, and feel the outside and they feel a bit crispy. Don't be afraid and think that, oh my God, it's all dried up now. It's the outer leaves and they've now folded down around your bud, those little leaves, and they're protecting some of that moisture. So you can trim now out the outside. When you take that off of the branch, I assure you, when you look at the stem, you're going to see that it's still wet in its core. Yeah. This then now allows you to slowly work with your plant and cure them and move that moisture through. I think it just enhances the flavor more to go with sort of a dry trim. That's the difference today. As a home grower with your 4 plants, you can take that additional time. Enjoy it.
What's the ideal environment for drying?
Let's say you go in, if you're down, let's say in your basement where your hot water tank is, that room is probably about 80 degrees. What does that be on the Celsius? About 27. That seems to be about the right temperature. And it takes about 3 to 5 days to get them to dry in there. You don't want to go too slow. I mean, I've seen people do this where they'll put their plants to dry and maybe the temperature hasn't even hit 70 or 75. Well, now they're going to get rot. And I've seen this happen. People have spent 3, 4, 5 months growing these plants and then put them somewhere that doesn't have enough warmth or enough movement of air, and their plants just rot on the stem hanging up.
But often warmth brings humidity too. How do you control that environment?
Well, indoors, chances are, I would say that most of us are indoors. We're not really dealing with humidity as much as, let's say, an outdoor environment. Now, of course, that could change if you're growing in a garage or an outdoor arena. Yeah. Those are things you'd have to look towards. And, of course, then you're going to have to look towards adding heaters. Always remember is that these are a tropical plant. They must be recognized and treated accordingly. If you start treating these things like, sort of they're a winter plant, no, you're going to run into significant difficulties. So the drying period, like I say, this is the temperatures you would want, somewhere warm, somewhere that, is a bit dry. Like I say, a garage, add a heater, and maybe even a little fan if you need to, and watch them. If they're out there for a day or two, they're hanging and they still feel wet, that's not good.
Yeah.
Okay, they should not feel wet. They should actually start to see that they are drying up a bit.
Okay.
If they're remaining wet, add more heat, because otherwise they're going to rot on the stem.
What about circulating the air? You come out of the shower in the morning, most people use a blow dryer.
Right.
Is it good to have a fan on, or is it bad to have a fan on?
Well, I would say you could have a fan on, to keep the air moving. You might not necessarily want it, blowing really hard on the plants, because it could just dry them too quickly. And that's not what you want to do. You want them to dry naturally and sort of to give up their water naturally. Okay. So a little fan, just keeping the air moving, doesn't have to be much.
Well, could I just hang them in my tent to dry?
Well, yeah, you could. Because you've got an available space. But my concern would be is that you're maybe not going to get the warmth in there, especially if you keep it in, and you're not going to have your lights on. This is not a good time to have your lights on with your plants during drying. It will damage them. It'd be no different than leaving something sitting out in the sunshine. It's going to bleach them, it's going to cause damage, and that's not what you want. It'll break down the THC, and you want to try to maintain as much of that as possible. So yes, you could do it in your tent. You've got the space to do it, but be aware that they do need the warmth. They do need a bit of circulation of air. Once again, after this length of time, you do not want to rot them on the stem. Exactly. It would be a terrible thing. Exactly. And I know it's happened. I have had people tell me that they've done this, and they thought that if they dry too quick, and so they put them somewhere in their basement where it's too cold, and 3 days later they go down there and it's all rotten now. They rot really quick, really.
Well, I took your advice to do a dry trim, and I yank the girls out of the tent and I line them up and peel off the last of the big fan leaves. And as I'm doing it, I'm starting to get super anxious. It's like I'm about to slaughter these girls, but I've had this relationship with them for 4 months. Do you ever feel that?
I think we all do. It's one of those things you've spent, well, like you say, you spent 4 months with these, you've gotten to know them, you really get involved is what's happening. You see them every day. There's an emotional bond for some reason or another. And so it's not uncommon at all.
I don't feel that way about tomatoes.
No.
I have no problem grabbing them and eating them right off the tree while all the other tomatoes watch me do it.
Yeah, you're right, actually. Yeah, I've never pulled a cherry out of a tree and thought, damn, right? But my involvement with that cherry was limited.
Yeah.
Exactly. Where this, it's
a one-night
stand. Yeah, exactly. It is actually. Yeah, I've been hanging out with these girls for a while. It's like, I'm going to miss them. What am I going to do tomorrow?
Plant more.
Exactly. Yeah, the breakup is always hard.
Breaking up is hard. Well, I hung the plants in my tent, turned out the lights, turned the fan on, and after about a week, I went in and felt them, and they were getting nice and crispy. I was just dying to smoke one. But do I really have to cure them?